All right, let's dive into something specific that you've shared some sources on. It's a challenge many federal employees, especially, USPS letter carriers face, navigating the Office of Workers' Compensation Programs, or OWCP, after an injury on the job.
It really is. It's a system that's supposed to be a safety net,
Yeah.
right? Governed by federal law, the Federal Employees Compensation Act, FECA. But as the material you provided clearly shows, actually getting those benefits can feel incredibly complex and, well, frankly, overwhelming if you're not ready for it.
Absolutely. So think of this deep dive as sort of cutting through that complexity. We're aiming to pull the crucial information you need directly from these sources to really understand the system.
Yeah, our mission here is basically to spotlight the major hurdles that injured carriers often hit when dealing with OWCP. And importantly, extract those practical insights and tips that are often kind of buried in the process, all based on the material you gave us.
Because this isn't just, filling out a form. It involves really strict forms, tight deadlines, and this often tricky back and forth between the Postal Service and the Department of Labor, which is where OWCP lives.
Right. And what we're seeing across these sources are, maybe 5 key areas where things consistently seem to trip people up.
Okay, so let's explore those and figure out what you, the listener, can really learn from this.
So when you get injured, that very first step is usually reporting it and filing the paperwork.
Right.
But what the sources really highlight as a major point of, let's say, confusion is simply knowing which form to use and getting it right from the start.
Right, the forms. There's the CA1 for a traumatic injury like a sudden thing, a fall, a dog bite,
And something specific.
And then there's the CA2 for an occupational disease or illness, something that develops over time because of your work, like carpal tunnel or maybe a back issue from repetitive lifting.
Exactly. And a specific pitfall the material points out is when USPS management might mistakenly give you or encourage you to file a CA2A. Now, that form is only for a recurrence of an old injury,
Not for a new one.
not for a new one, even if it feels similar or it's in the same body part. Using that wrong form can immediately get your claim filed improperly, which causes big problems.
And the material is really, really clear on this. Incomplete or incorrect paperwork is a top reason for claims being denied, or just significantly delayed.
Oh, absolutely. Even seemingly minor mistakes or just missing a field, forgetting a signature,
Yeah.
that can cause major headaches down the line.
Yeah, and some accounts in the sources, they mention issues where maybe a supervisor re-enters the initial report into the system and they might accidentally,
Yeah.
or maybe not so accidentally, omit or downplay details the carrier put down.
Right, those discrepancies can definitely create problems later when OWCP is reviewing the case.
So the critical takeaway here, right at the very beginning, what's the big tip?
File the proper form, the CA1 or the CA2, as soon as you possibly can after the injury happens, like immediately if possible.
Okay.
And double check every single field for accuracy and completeness.
Yeah.
If you're at all unsure which form is right, maybe especially if it feels like a re-injury,
Yeah, that seems confusing.
definitely. Get advice from your union rep or someone who specializes in OWCP cases before you submit it. And always include a detailed, specific description of exactly how and when the incident happened. Be clear.
And keep copies. That seems like a theme running through this. Keep a copy of absolutely everything you submit and everything management gives you back.
Crucial. And make sure management submits their part of the form within that required 10-day window. And, try to verify that their account of what happened actually matches yours.
Okay.
And maybe the most critical deadline highlighted here involves the CA1. It must be filed within 30 days of that traumatic injury if you want to be eligible for continuation of pay or COP.
30 days. That's not long.
It's not. And missing that 30-day window means you forfeit your right to COP, which is, it's your regular pay.
Yeah.
It's a huge benefit. So timely action is absolutely essential right there at the start.
Okay, so let's say you've managed to navigate that initial paperwork correctly. The sources show the next big hurdle often comes up when you need medical support. This is where finding the right doctor and getting the specific documentation OWCP requires, well, that becomes a major challenge.
Yeah, what the sources describe are really 2 connected problems here. First, just finding a doctor who's actually willing to treat federal workers' comp cases.
Right.
A lot of medical providers, unfortunately, they just shy away from them, maybe because of perceived administrative hassles, the red tape, Or maybe because OWCP's fee schedules might be lower than what they typically get from private insurance.
That example you mentioned, the carrier in Missouri having to call dozens of clinics just to find one that accepts OWCP cases.
Wow.
That really drives the point home. It's not just a small inconvenience, it's a serious barrier to getting care and getting the paperwork you need.
Exactly. And that leads right into the second issue, which is maybe an even more frequent reason claims get denied: getting the right kind of medical documentation.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, OWCP doesn't just need a diagnosis like sprained ankle. They require a detailed medical narrative from the doctor that explicitly links your diagnosed injury or illness directly to your specific work conditions or that specific incident at work.
Ah, okay. So this is where a lot of claims seem to falter. The sources often cite things like lack of a rationalized medical report explaining causation as a really common reason for denial.
Yes. Using an example from the material, say you suffered a torn rotator cuff. It's not enough for your doctor to just write torn rotator cuff. They must include a statement explaining how, in their medical opinion, lifting those mail trays at work on that specific date caused that tear.
Got it. They need the why.
They need the why linked to the job. Without that clear causal connection stated by the doctor, OWCP can, and often does, deny the claim just based on insufficient medical evidence.
And then there's the matter of these OWCP specific forms, right? Like the CA-17 or CA-20. Doctors who aren't familiar with the federal system might just be hesitant, or maybe they just don't know what specific details or language OWCP needs.
That's a really key point. The sources also mention some technical requirements, like making sure reports are signed by an MD, a medical doctor, or a DO, a doctor of osteopathy.
Okay.
If you happen to be seen by, say, a physician's assistant, a PA, or a nurse practitioner, an NP, a physician might need to co-sign that report for OWCP.
To know.
And under FECA, there are also some limitations regarding chiropractors. Often they need objective findings like x-rays to back up the claim for OWCP to accept it.
So pulling it together, what's the essential advice from the sources when it comes to getting the medical side right?
Well, first, try your best to find a doctor who actually has experience with federal workers' comp cases, if you possibly can. Your union might have lists, or OWCP has an online provider search tool that could help. And when you see the doctor, be prepared. Bring them a detailed description of your job duties, what you actually do day to day, and exactly what happened during the incident that caused the injury.
And be really clear with the doctor, right? Tell them their report must state that, in their medical opinion, the injury or illness is work-related.
Yes, using phrasing like within a reasonable degree of medical certainty can be helpful. And then get that initial medical narrative and any other supporting documents submitted promptly to OWCP. Don't sit on it.
All right, so you've reported the injury, you're starting to get medical attention. The sources highlight another pretty significant area of difficulty next: continuation of pay or complications.
COP PU.
Yes.
This benefit getting up to 45 calendar days of your regular pay for a traumatic injury, it sounds straightforward on the surface, but the sources reveal it can actually be a real battleground sometimes.
So what are the tripwires here?
Well, the material outlines very strict eligibility requirements. We mentioned the first one.
Yeah.
You absolutely must have filed that CA1 within 30 days of the injury. That's non-negotiable for COP.
Okay, what else?
You also have to actually lose time from work within 45 days of the injury happening. And crucially, you need to provide OWCP with a doctor's note verifying your disability, your inability to work within 10 calendar days of when you start losing that time.
10 days for the doctor's note. Okay.
Yeah. And again, missing that initial 30-day CA1 deadline, you lose COP eligibility completely.
And the sources also talk about management pushback.
Right.
Or even just denying COP outright, often because of arguments over limited duty offers.
Yes, this is a really frustrating scenario that comes up in the material. There's that specific example of the Midwestern carrier who broke her foot. Her doctor clearly stated she couldn't drive.
Okay.
But management apparently offered her a driving assignment as limited duty. When she declined based on her doctor's orders, they denied her COM and started charging her sick leave instead.
Wow. What happened?
Well, eventually, OWCP sided with her, confirming she was medically justified in declining that specific offer. But the source mentioned it took a lot of effort, even needing a congressional inquiry, because USPS hadn't apparently forwarded the paperwork properly to OWCP for them to even make a decision on the COP initially.
That's intense. It really shows that management doesn't always get it right or follow the rules, and you might have to freight for it.
Absolutely. The sources also clarify the waiting period for COP. The first 3 calendar days you're out might use your sick leave or LWOP leave without pay. Then, COP potentially kicks in for days 4 through 45, but only if your disability lasts longer than those first 3 days.
Okay. And there's also a risk, isn't there? If your claim eventually gets denied by OWCP, that cop you received can be charged back.
That's right, it's a debt you'd owe. And the sources suggest this sometimes leads to management being overly cautious or maybe improperly cautious and just using sick leave or LWOP from the get-go instead of initiating COP.
Like that account mentioned where someone's sick leave was charged for months while they waited. Instead of getting COP, they were likely entitled to.
Exactly. So, key tips for navigating COP, based on what we're seeing in the sources. First, make sure you actually check the box on the CA1 form to elect COP. You have to choose it.
Right.
Understand your rights. Maybe try to educate your supervisor if they seem unsure, though that can be tricky. If you are denied COP, ask for the reason in writing immediately. Don't accept a verbal denial.
And involve your union steward right away.
Absolutely. Get help. Your medical notes need to be crystal clear about your inability to perform your regular duties or specific limited duties, if that's the issue.
So if management offers you limited duty,
Have your doctor review the specific offer. Make sure it's medically appropriate for your condition and limitations. And the sources really stress this. Do not just stay home without communicating your status or providing the documentation. Keep management informed in writing about your work status and your medical limitations.
okay. And if COP is denied incorrectly,
Well, you have options later, like filing a grievance or claiming those lost wages, using a different form, the CA7, but only if your underlying OWCP claim is eventually accepted.
right, so that takes time, doesn't help with the immediate bills.
Exactly. It doesn't solve the immediate financial hardship.
Hmm.
So knowing these COP rules up front and being ready to advocate for yourself seems really critical to avoid that stress.
Okay. Moving beyond the specific forms and benefits like COP, the sources also highlight a broader systemic challenge. It seems to be about communication and just general case management difficulties. Like interacting with the OWCP system itself is hard.
It definitely sounds like it's not the most user-friendly system. The sources point out you can't use email for claims communication. That's because of Privacy Act rules protecting your sensitive medical info.
So you're stuck with.
Phone calls, physical mail, or using their online portal, which is called e-com.
And trying to actually reach a claims examiner on the phone sounds like, yep, good luck.
Yeah, the sources mention high call volumes, examiners having really heavy caseloads. There's an example of the Kansas City district office covering like 5 states. And the NALC, the letter carriers union, has apparently cited budget cuts and staffing shortages as contributing factors to long delays in processing and just getting responses.
Fewer examiners, more claims, leads to backlog.
Pretty much. And compounding this, according to the sources, is often a lack of clear or sometimes even accurate information coming from local USPS management about your claim status or what you need to do next.
That experience of the rural carrier you mentioned earlier seems to perfectly illustrate this. She had literally no idea if her claim had even been received by OWCP.
Right, until she took the initiative, created an e-comp account herself, and checked online. And her quote was really telling. Management will not help you. E-comp is the DL site. It was the only way I got accepted.
Wow. That really points to a crucial realization from these sources, doesn't it? Injured employees have to take an active role. You have to manage your own case.
Yes. You absolutely cannot assume USPS is handling everything correctly or, frankly, promptly. You need to be the one monitoring that e-comp portal, uploading documents yourself if needed, and keeping track of all the deadlines.
The sources say USPS is supposed to forward documents quickly.
But that does not always happen, is how one source put it.
Yeah.
You have to follow up.
So basically, you become your own case manager while you're trying to recover from an injury.
Pretty much. And when you do need to interact with an examiner, the sources suggest being prepared. Have your case number ready, know your specific question, keep it professional and concise.
And use e-com for written questions or sending evidence.
Yeah, that often seems more efficient than relying on mail. And remember that Privacy Act thing we mentioned? OWCP can't talk about your case specifics with anyone else, not management, not family, unless you've given them specific written permission on file.
Okay, so what are the essential tips then for navigating this communication maze?
Check your e-comp account. Check it frequently. Development letters, those are the crucial requests for more information OWCP needs and decisions, often show up there faster than waiting for the mail.
And respond to those letters.
Yes, respond within the deadlines given. It's almost always 30 calendar days. Missing those deadlines is, as the sources highlight, a super common and often preventable reason for denial.
What if you just can't get through to your examiner?
The sources suggest trying your union compensation specialist. They might have better contacts. Or calling the main OWCP customer service number. Persistence seems key.
And keep copies, again.
Of everything. Everything you send, everything you receive. Log your medical appointments, log the dates you miss work. The sources basically recommend treating this whole OWCP process like it's a part-time job where you're proactively tracking your claim status every week.
It sounds like a lot of extra work when you're already hurt.
It absolutely is. But it sounds like it's necessary to avoid potentially disastrous delays or missed deadlines that could sink your claim.
Okay, finally, the sources tackle the issue of initial claim denials. And this constant burden of proof that seems to be placed squarely on the injured employee. It's clear getting denied is, well, pretty common and, obviously, really distressing.
Yes, and it happens because OWCP applies very strict standards under that FECA law. If any required piece of evidence or information is missing or maybe just doesn't meet their specific criteria, the claim can be denied.
And the material identifies insufficient medical evidence as, yet again, the #1 reason for these denials.
Precisely. Just like we discussed earlier, that doctor's report must clearly and persuasively connect the diagnosis back to the work incident with solid medical reasoning. If it doesn't, a very common reason you'll see cited in denial letters is something like causal relationship not established.
Even if you know it was work-related.
Exactly. The sources emphasize this. You know it happened at work, but it must be proven on paper in a way that satisfies OWCP's requirements.
What are other common reasons for denial mentioned?
Not filing the initial claim on time, that 30-day window again. Lack of supporting witness statements sometimes. Inconsistencies maybe between your account and a supervisor's report. And, critically, failing to respond to those OWCP development letters within the 30-day deadline.
We keep coming back to those development letters.
Because the sources really hammer this point. Missing the deadline to respond to a request for information is a major and often preventable reason for denial. These letters aren't just updates. They are requests for specific information. OWCP needs to fill gaps in your claim before they can make a decision. If you don't provide it, they often just deny it by default.
The material also mentions scenarios like short form closures, where maybe a minor injury seems okay at first, but then gets denied later if the carrier needs more time off or treatment and hasn't sent in updated documents.
Right. Or situations where OWCP might accept a basic condition, like maybe a sprain, but you have to really fight an appeal to get them to accept a more serious underlying issue, like a tear that requires surgery.
But here's a really crucial, maybe hopeful point the sources emphasize. A denial is not necessarily the end of the road.
Absolutely not. You have appeal rights under FECA. You can request things like a hearing or what's called reconsideration. And very importantly, the sources state that many initial denials are overturned on appeal, but usually only when additional or clarifying evidence is provided.
The slogan mentioned was, "Don't despair, appeal."
That's it.
So how should someone approach an appeal based on the sources? What's the strategy?
First step, read that denial letter very, very carefully. Focus on the section called Basis for Denial. It will tell you exactly why OWCP denied the claim and what specific information or evidence they felt was missing or inadequate.
Okay, find the gap.
Find the gap. Then the goal of the appeal is to fill that gap. Often this means going back to your doctor and getting them to write a more detailed medical narrative, one that specifically addresses the deficiency OWCP cited. It needs to provide that required medical reasoning for the causal link.
And if the denial was about facts, not medical evidence.
Then you need to provide the missing witness statements, or maybe submit a clarifying statement yourself to address any inconsistencies. The example given was about a torn meniscus claim. Initially, maybe it was accepted only as a strain, then denied for more treatment. But it succeeded on appeal once the carrier provided the MRI results clearly showing the tear, along with a strong doctor's statement explicitly linking that tear to the work injury.
Makes sense. Provide the proof they said was missing.
Exactly. So, key tips for dealing with the denial. First, immediately contact your union compensation specialist, or maybe find an attorney who specializes in federal workers' comp cases. Get expert guidance. They can help you understand the denial and figure out the best appeal strategy.
And watch those deadlines again.
Absolutely critical. You generally only have 30 days from the date of the denial letter to request certain types of appeals, like a hearing. For reconsideration, where you submit new evidence, you usually have up to 1 year. But don't wait.
Focus the appeal specifically on fixing the problem OWCP pointed out.
Yes. Don't just resubmit the same stuff. Address the specific deficiency cited in the denial. An oral hearing might be a good option if the issue involves conflicting factual accounts of how the injury happened. Gives you a chance to explain.
And be aware, right, you probably won't get comp or wage benefits during the appeal process itself.
That's usually the case.
Yeah.
So you might need to use your own sick leave, annual leave, or go on LWP if you can't work while the appeal is pending. If you win the appeal, you can usually claim back that leave or lost wages later, but again, that takes time.
But the big message from the sources about denials seems to be persist.
Yes, don't give up easily. Many claims that get initially denied are ultimately accepted once the injured employee, often with help, provides the necessary documentation and evidence through the appeal process. It takes effort, but it can work.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this. Looking across everything we've learned from these sources, what are the absolute core takeaways for someone who might have to navigate this OWCP process?
Yeah, looking at the material as a whole, the core lessons really seem to crystallize into maybe 5 key points for you, the listener.
Okay, number 1.
Report and file immediately. Especially getting that CA1 within 30 days for COP eligibility is critical, but just prompt reporting for any injury helps establish the credibility of your claim from the start.
Right. Number 2.
Documentation is everything. Accuracy, completeness, and detail in both the initial paperwork and, maybe most critically, in those medical reports that link the injury to your work duties. That's paramount. The sources were incredibly clear. Insufficient documentation, especially the medical evidence part, is the #1 reason claims get denied.
Okay, a third key takeaway.
Know your rights and your deadlines.
Yeah.
Understand the specific rules around things like POP and the absolute non-negotiable importance of responding to those OWCP development letters within that 30-day window. You have to stay organized.
Fourth point.
Be your own advocate. The system, as described, isn't really set up to hold your hand. You can't just rely solely on management to handle everything correctly or on time. Use the eComp portal yourself. Proactively track your claims progress and get your union steward or compensation specialist involved early. That proactive communication and self-management, according to the sources, really makes a huge difference.
And the fifth takeaway?
Appeal if needed, and don't give up. Denials happen frequently, but they aren't necessarily final. You have appeal rights under the law, and with the right evidence, and often some guidance, many initial denials are overturned. Persistence is absolutely key. Don't be afraid to seek help if you hit that denial wall.
So the material you provided really paints a picture of a system that is, well, complex and often quite bumpy to navigate. But by understanding these common pitfalls we've discussed, by having this knowledge drawn from the sources and knowing where you can seek support, you are definitely much better equipped to navigate it and assert your rights under FECA.
It absolutely sounds like it requires a lot of diligence and attention to detail, all during a time when you're likely already dealing with the stress and pain of being injured.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It just adds another layer of difficulty onto an already challenging situation. So wrapping this up, what does all this really mean for you as you consider this deep dive?
Well, this exploration of the OWCP process, specifically for letter carriers based on these sources, it shows us that while it definitely presents significant challenges, it's not necessarily an impenetrable fortress. It clearly demands diligence, meticulous attention to detail, and frankly, unwavering persistence from the injured employee.
It also starkly highlights a system that appears to be under considerable strain, doesn't it? The sources repeatedly bring up things like communication breakdowns, heavy caseloads, staffing shortages within both USPS and OWCP itself, and all of that adds significant hurdles for injured workers who are just trying to access the benefits they're legally entitled to.
And here's where it gets, I think, really interesting. Considering how frequently the sources mention the impact of these systemic factors, things like heavy caseloads, staffing issues, just complex bureaucracy, on the basic ability to get a claim processed fairly or even just get a question answered. What does that tell us? What does that suggest about the broader systemic challenges facing essential federal workers when they're simply trying to access basic support after being injured doing their job?
Right. What does that provoke you, the listener, to consider about the larger support structures, or perhaps sometimes the lack thereof, for the very people who keep critical services running day in and day out, often facing real physical risks while doing so? Definitely something to mull over as you digest this deep